world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Sunday, November 30th, as you are listening to this. And of course, we got a lot to talk about. Now, we're wrapping up the month of November. It has been a rather interesting month. And of course, this podcast is coming again later than I anticipated. I was hoping to have it out earlier in the day. I was hoping to record not long after I recorded yesterday's podcast. That didn't end up working out. And even though there's snow here, and it ended up not being as bad as what they were predicting, still had to go to work, so I couldn't get out of that and wasn't able to get it recorded before I left for work, so I'm recording now. I'm going to hopefully get this recorded and up to you guys as soon as possible. I promised you a daily show, and that's what you're going to get. Now, one of the biggest stories that has gotten a lot of traction right now, and it has a lot of legs, is this story, and it's not really a story. I don't know how to describe it. This report, anyway, that has come out, and I don't know who leaked it, that Pete Hegseth turned around and had ordered the military to, quote, kill them all when it came to these Venezuelan drug boats. Now, we don't even know for sure that they were drug boats because they didn't follow any due process. I have said it before. The proper procedure would have been to follow them with GPS, surveillance, etc. And then once they hit U.S. waters, have the Coast Guard or even the Navy intercept them, search the ship if they were found to be running drugs, seize that, charge them with crimes against the United States, try them, and punish them according to those crimes. You don't send the military out to be judge, jury, and executioner. But see, Donald Trump thinks this makes him look tough. And he's thinking it's getting him positive headlines and that, it's going to take away from all of the other distractions that are going on, or it's going to distract, I should say, from the other things that are going on. It's not working. Well, this story comes out. And Pete Hegseth, according to the report, there was a bomb or a ship that was bombed, and it didn't completely sink after the first bomb. So there were some survivors. They were hanging off the side of the boat, in no way, shape, or form able to continue doing anything other than fight for their lives. And they got blown up a second time and ultimately killed. Now, we are not in an active war with Venezuela. Donald Trump may want to claim that we are in some kind of armed conflict or something that necessitates this kind of a response with the drug cartels. But the drug cartels are not officially in charge of any country. So how does that work? So apparently war crimes potentially could be off the table. But then that just turns around and it becomes, potentially some international crimes, international murder charges, things like that, because you can't just blow up boats in international waters. And beyond that, it would be possibly a murder charge, federal murder charges for these strikes. Well, Donald Trump was talking to reporters, and he has disavowed any knowledge of Pete Hegseth ordering a second strike or even saying kill them all. He's saying that, well, according to Pete Hegseth, that Hegseth said he never said that and he doesn't know anything about it. It's funny, for being the president and being the most powerful man in the world, holding the highest office in the country, and supposedly being the stable genius that he claims to be, how many things he just seems to not know anything about. It's really quite shocking. Whenever you ask him a tough question, he comes up with, well, I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. And if he's if he's doing like a public cabinet meeting or something, he turns around and he deflects it over to one of the members of his cabinet, one of his secretaries, and says, well, I don't really know much about that, or Pam Bondi's more qualified to answer that, or whoever he chooses to pick on that day. Donald Trump really doesn't know a lot for being this supposed genius and claiming that he's in charge and he's actually doing all of this. So who's really running the show? But Pete Hegseth is in a lot of hot water with this, and this is gaining ground. This story is actually picking up a lot of steam, and this proves how far the Republican Party is fracturing from Donald Trump. And why do I say that? Well, there's going to be two separate bipartisan investigations into this event or these series of events, depending on how this all plays out. And we're going to see how these two investigations coincide and how they change things, etc., and what do they look at. And none of it's going to be good for Pete Hegseth or Donald Trump. It's going to be nothing but bad news. Why? Well, because there are bipartisan investigations in both chambers of the House and the Senate. Okay? Each chamber is looking at this thing, but it's a bipartisan thing, which means Republicans have signed off on it. Again, fracturing the party. They're willing to look into it, and ultimately, Pete Hegseth could be on the hook for some of the things that come out. Now, is Donald Trump going to charge Pete Hegseth right now for anything? No. Okay. How could this play out? Well, they do the investigation. If there ends up being believable witnesses and corroborating evidence that proves that this happened multiple times, etc., Congress has the authority to impeach Pete Hegseth. Remember, impeachment is not limited to just the President of the United States. They can impeach members of the cabinet, they could impeach judges, etc. Would Republicans impeach Pete Hegseth? Wouldn't take very many with all Democrats. Now, I don't think they would make that move, just like moving against Donald Trump, unless they knew they were going to get the conviction in the Senate. However, it is more likely that they would make a move on Pete Hegseth, regardless of whether they get a conviction in the Senate, to put pressure on Donald Trump. So they could be talking impeachment. Now, what else could happen? Well, Pete Hegseth was only a major in the National Guard. Normally, people in his position have attained the rank of general, admiral, somewhere up the chain of command quite a ways. But Pete Hegseth wasn't. But he was still a commissioned officer in the National Guard. Now, I believe, and I could be wrong, I don't know if the National Guard is separate or different in this regard than the standing military. But when it comes to the military, they could always recall Pete Hegseth and court-martial him, potentially. Now, assuming the National Guard works the same way as the regular Army or any other branch of the military, because that's what they wanted to do with Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona. Now, the senator from Arizona was a member of these 6 members of Congress that made this video, this ad, reminding servicemen and women that they did not have to follow illegal or unlawful orders. And now that we are hearing about this event, it seems like this is exactly what they were talking about. So Pete Hegseth could potentially get recalled. He could get court-martialed, I believe. Now, if I am wrong, somebody in the comments correct me about the military and about if the National Guard if they can still get recalled like they can regular Army, etc. Now, I don't think enlisted personnel can get recalled. I think this only applies to officers. But again, correct me if I'm wrong. I never served. I was never an officer or anything like that. So I don't know from firsthand experience. I only know what I have seen and read. And I admit my knowledge on a lot of how the military works is not as broad as some other topics. But Pete Hegseth could be facing that. He could also be facing an impeachment. Now, if he gets impeached and removed by the Senate, what could happen? Well, there's only two punishments for impeachment. Impeachment is the bringing of charges from the House of Representatives. Okay, they pass it. They only need a simple majority to do that. That would mean all Democrats and like 4 Republicans. And since they've got a bipartisan support for this committee in the House already, they've already got 1 or 2 at least Republicans in the House of Representatives on board. If this investigation leads anywhere, they would probably be willing to go ahead and sign off on articles of impeachment. So they impeach Pete Hegseth. Okay. Now it goes over to the Senate and they hold trial. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they convict Pete Hegseth. Okay. If the Republicans convict Pete Hegseth, what happens? There's only 2 punishments. They can remove him from office, and if they remove him from office, they can ban him from ever holding federal office like that ever again. That's it. There is no penalty of incarceration. He is not facing any criminal charges or things like that. So those are the 2 options. Could they do it? Well, of course they could. Will they? It's going to depend on if these investigations prove anything and how much steam this story gets and plays in the media and where their voters land on it, right? Look at what happened with the public backlash when it came to the Epstein files. We put enough pressure on congressional Republicans that basically they passed the measure to release the Epstein files with all but 1 vote. Okay? If there's enough public pressure on them to do this, they will do it. So Hegseth could be impeached and removed. It's unlikely, but not impossible or not improbable. Now, I'm seeing some people suggest that it's not going to matter, that nothing's going to see the light of day, nothing's going to happen, that this is just a nothing burger, much like everything else when it comes to this administration. Well, here's the thing. Donald Trump can't completely protect Pete Hegseth in this. Sure, he comes out saying he doesn't know anything about it and he believes Hegseth. And he'll say that for now. When the public opinion turns on Pete Hegseth to a point Donald Trump can't ignore it, he'll turn on Pete Hegseth. It's kind of like watching, what was it? The Gladiator. I think it was Gladiator, but any of the movies about the Roman Colosseum and stuff. When you have your champion and should we protect the champion or what do you think? And people resoundingly boo, and then the emperor just turns his thumb down on the gladiator, and they release the lions, and they are ready to kill him, right? That's how Donald Trump acts. Once the people have turned on Hegseth, and he's starting to look bad, and Donald Trump doesn't like looking bad, he doesn't like taking the negative press. He still believes he's got an 80-some% approval rating, which is ridiculous. He could end up asking Hegseth to resign or firing him outright. Just depends on what the pressure is like. But it's not. But people are saying Donald Trump is going to pardon Hegseth. Okay, cool. If he pardons Pete Hegseth, and this is one of the things I had to look up, the pardon would prevent the military from calling back Pete Hegseth to active duty and court-martialing him. Okay. It would preempt that. It would prevent any criminal penalties for any of the actions he did. Sure, it would do that. But pardons do not apply to impeachment. Why? Well, I talked about it just a little bit ago. There's only 2 penalties for impeachment: removal from office and a lifetime ban from serving. There is no threat of confinement. There is no other criminal penalty. Therefore, the president cannot pardon for an impeachment. So Hegseth could still be out of a job. And even if they don't get to the point where they impeach him before Donald Trump fires him, and they still investigate the rest of the matter, we'll see what comes out, which generals and which admirals, etc., knew what and when, who advised them not to do this, who said, hey, we can't be attacking unarmed civilians, etc. And this isn't going to end well for the administration. And of course, if it looks like they're trying to cover anything up, it's going to end up badly for the administration too. Remember, when it comes to things like this, a lot of times it's not the initial act. And don't get me wrong, murdering these supposed drug runners, and I say it that way because we don't know for sure, because they didn't follow due process, is a horrible thing. Okay? They need to be held accountable. We do need to hold them accountable. And while there's no statute of limitations, we just have to let it play its course. I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. But we're going to have to see how this goes here. And like I said, as horrible as these crimes are, I was talking about the cover-up. There we go. I got back on track. The cover-up, if it looks like they are trying to cover this thing up and bury it under the rug, and like now that it's out in the public sphere, the cover-up ends up being worse than the initial crime. The cover-up ultimately was what brought down Nixon when it came to Watergate. It wasn't just the illegal wiretapping and breaking into DNC headquarters. It was how they tried to cover it up above and beyond the fact. And that's when they were ready to look into it. And they started to say, okay, who knew what and when? And when they were really digging into it, there were a lot of people that ultimately went to jail. Now, not Nixon because he got a pardon, but ultimately people involved in the cover-up were just as guilty as those who didn't do anything with the cover-up. So just because Donald Trump is trying to cover it up now or whatever, if they do try to bury this, it may not work. It may come back to bite them. This is just another story that ends up shining a horrible light on this administration. Now, like I said, we have these two bipartisan investigations, and they're both going to be digging into this event. What they'll find, who knows? And how many people are going to go by the wayside with Donald Trump? Now, I mentioned the fact that Donald Trump could pardon Pete Hegseth, and he could. Hell, he could pardon everybody involved in those strikes. Again, it looks like you're covering something up. When what would Donald Trump gain? Not really anything, right? What does Donald Trump gain by pardoning them? Nothing. Because without the pardon during this congressional investigation, if they call Pete Hegseth to testify, they ask him, did you say kill them all and order a second shot on unarmed civilians? He can plead the fifth. Now, you're not supposed to infer anything from pleading the fifth, but he could do it. He could plead the fifth and say, I'm not going to incriminate myself. They could ask, did you and Donald Trump have conversations about bombing unarmed civilians if there were survivors of these fishing boats? And he can say, I plead the fifth, because there could be criminal liability for him discussing it with President Trump, despite the fact that Donald Trump has immunity, right? Donald Trump has immunity for official acts. Now, if this comes out and that we really did bomb boats for the sake of bombing boats, and we had no intel that said they were drug boats, assuming that's the case, giving the order to bomb civilian fishing boats in foreign waters is not an official act of a president. Not really. It would put a test on this immunity ruling that Donald Trump got. And of course, any sort of thing that would test it, the courts would look at and they would try to decide one way or the other, and it could get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court again. And they may have the option to fix their mistake and take away presidential immunity. I mean, the ruling they gave was pretty weak on the surface anyway, but it did what it was trying to do, which was effectively give Donald Trump time. It was a delay tactic in all of his criminal cases. So he didn't have to testify about certain things. He didn't have to turn over certain documents, etc. And it gave him time to get to the point where he won the presidency, and he could take, and then once he took office, well, can't be charged because he's a sitting president. So if the Supreme Court were to look at their immunity ruling because of a challenge, say, brought by this investigation, as Pete Hegseth is like, well, I don't want to look at it. And besides, any conversation I had with Donald Trump is covered by immunity. This whole thing could lead to a gray area that brings it back before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could challenge it. See, this is where this administration is at this point. Everything is collapsing around them, right? As this is another story. Donald Trump wasn't expecting to have to defend his position on these fishing boats, on, so his supposed attacks on drug smuggling boats. Again, say it that way because we don't know for sure. The proper procedure, as I talked about earlier, should have been that the boats get to the United States waters, seize them, search, and make sure that that contraband was on there before we took them through the criminal justice system here in the United States. But that's not what they did. And this story is gaining legs. Donald Trump now has to defend that. He's defending the Epstein files and his handling of Epstein, etc., and all of the things related to that. At every turn, there is just more and more and more Donald Trump is having to defend. And there's been more pushback from his own party. I've talked about it already. There are going to be a vote, or there's going to be a vote in the House coming up soon on this discharge petition that would basically reaffirm collective bargaining with the unions for federal employees. Now, Donald Trump doesn't want to have to do anything when it comes to collective bargaining, but the courts have told him, yeah, you have to. And this is just more, even though I don't think it'll change anything, and I don't think Donald Trump would actually sign the law. Now, I don't know if it's going to gain enough steam to have a veto-proof majority like the Epstein file release did, but potentially it could. And it's just another sign that the cracks are forming pretty deep in the Republican Party. They are getting ready to walk away from Donald Trump. Now, you'd think they would have done that already, that they would have broken from Donald Trump all the way back in 2021, when you have his mishandling of COVID and January 6th. And they had an opportunity. Let's not forget, Mitch McConnell could have voted to remove Donald Trump from office, and they could have banned him for life from ever holding federal office ever again. But he came out weakly and said after it, and I don't mean weakly in the time, I mean he appeared very weak by saying it, and saying, well, Donald Trump's already out of office. It's not really a political issue anymore, and we need to let the criminal justice system handle it. Now, that's a very horrible Mitch McConnell impersonation. But anyway, that's what they did. If they would have just said, no, we're gonna vote to hold him accountable for this, and we're going to prevent him from holding office again, we wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be dealing with it now. And everything comes back to roost with Republicans. So now they have to make another choice with the collective bargaining, with the Epstein files. There's just so many things that this administration is juggling right now. It is scandal after scandal after scandal that Republicans are probably going to find a point when they have to walk away from Donald Trump. And they're going to say, okay, this is a bridge too far. we have to do something about this. We have to move on from Donald Trump. He is going to cost us the midterms. Okay. Donald Trump is a lame duck at this point. Now, they don't typically say you're going to be a lame duck until after the midterms of the last half of your presidency, typically because you could still influence the midterms. But the rate things are looking, the Republicans are probably going to lose the House by 40 or 50 seats, despite their efforts to gerrymander. And they're probably going to lose the Senate, or at least it's possible that they lose the Senate. And if they don't lose the Senate entirely, they're going to lose ground in the Senate. I just believe that there is going to be one hell of a blue wave, a blue tsunami, if you will. They are going to be pushing back against the Republicans. And Donald Trump is going to be caught blindsided by this. He's not going to know how to act because in his mind, everybody should think he's as great as he thinks he is, right? This is going to cause chaos and confusion in the Republican Party when we get to the midterms, if they do lose the House and the Senate. So Donald Trump's effectively a lame duck now, and the party's just deciding when is the right time to move away from Donald Trump. Now, could it be this story with the fishing boats and everything? It could. It really could, depending on what comes out and how bad it is. If they find out that Donald Trump was involved, etc., and public opinion turns on him, they could say, okay, enough's enough. We got to move away from Donald Trump, much like everything else. Or it could end up being just the Epstein files. That could be enough to move away. We are counting down, I don't remember what day specifically it is going to be, but someday next month, that deadline is going to hit when they have to release the Epstein files. And they are supposed to be in a downloadable and a searchable format. So what is going to happen is, as this stuff comes out, we're going to be digging through it. Now, we've already heard that they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in overtime for the FBI to go through and redact out a bunch of damning information for Republicans, if that report is true. And if it is, oh good Lord. If we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in overtime, et cetera, and thousands of man hours redacting the files, it's going to be for nothing. Because the DOJ or the FBI files aren't the only copies. Now, one of the latest sets of emails that came out did not come from the DOJ. They came from the Epstein estate itself. And they released the file, those things to the public. Other places are going to have access to some of the information. Not to mention, we still have a large number of the victims, the survivors, who are going to be giving their testimony in this whole thing. And as this all comes out, it is going to be one hell of a snowball that the Republicans can't dodge out of the way of. That they are going to have to do something here. And ultimately, if Donald Trump did end up influencing the FBI or forcing them to redact a bunch of things, and, public pressure gets big enough, they could ultimately agree to impeach and remove Donald Trump based on the Epstein files or his handling of the Epstein files. Would they do it? Possibly. Remember, politicians care about their own power above and beyond anything else. So when I say they could use the files to get rid of Donald Trump, I mean it. If he is in there and it is irrefutable and they can prove it's him, because supposedly there are images in there way worse than what we've heard is in there. And one of the images that we have heard is in the files is a picture of Donald Trump with two underage girls in his lap, both topless. And that's pretty bad by itself, but apparently that's the tip of the iceberg, and the other stuff is way, way worse. Now, if any of that is true and it is in there, the Republicans may use that as their launching point to impeach and remove Donald Trump. Why would they do that? Well, because they want to get gain favorability with voters going into the midterms. Okay. Things are looking pretty bad for the Republican Party. And as I said a little bit ago, they're looking at a potential wipeout in the midterms, 40 to 50 seats in the House, and, losing the Senate. If they lose the House in the midterms, they're probably not going to gain the House back for a decade, at least. Because typically you don't flip that many seats. It's not probable without massive gerrymandering or redistricting because of census or whatever. Republicans are in for one hell of a shock, and they may have to move on from Donald Trump. But in order to do that, they need that MAGA base, that 30 to 35% of the Republican Party, who typically would vote for Donald Trump no matter what, to still vote for them. So what would they do? They would vote to remove Donald Trump with the impeachment. They would convict him in the Senate based on his participation and his being in the Epstein files. Why? Because the MAGA movement is okay with going after people in the files, right? And they're more worried about protecting children, and the Republicans might be able to sell it to them that, hey, we had to move away from Donald Trump because of this. We didn't know it was really a thing. And I guarantee they could say it to the voters. Look, we didn't know he was in the Epstein files. You guys didn't know he was in the Epstein files. Don't feel hoodwinked or whatever. He lied to all of us, but we had to impeach and remove him for the good of the country and to protect the children. Some smooth line like that. Now, don't get me wrong. What he did, and if he is in the files and doing all those things to children, is horrible. But the Republicans would use it as an opportunity. Okay. And if they impeach and remove Donald Trump, I firmly believe that if there is articles of impeachment, as long as Republicans are in control of the Senate and Republicans have the majority in the House, if articles of impeachment do get passed, that we are going to see them succeed in the Senate, and that person would be removed. Now, I said it the way I said it about them having control of the House for a reason. One of the things we are watching is this race on Tuesday, just 3 days from now, where it is a very close House race for an open House seat. And I can't remember the name of the Republican, but Afton Bain is the Democrat that is running. This is a district that Donald Trump had won with 22% of the vote, or a 22% margin. Now, according to latest polling, Afton Bain, it has closed that gap within 2, or within the margin of error. Now, that could mean anything from Afton Bain loses by 5% to Afton Bain wins by 1%. And that has got to be terrifying to Republicans. Now, this Afton Bain race has got Republicans scared. Why? If Afton Bain wins and flips a safe Republican seat, they got to be looking at the midterms going and seeing the same thing I've been saying, that, oh shit, they're going to lose the House by 40 to 50 seats or more. Right? So, that being said, they need to figure out what they can do and how do they get ahead of it. Well, some of them are resigning. Okay. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said, well, I'm retiring as of January 5th, and I'm just out of Congress. And you're going to start seeing some other members of Congress on the Republican side if Afton Bain wins. And hell, if she wins outside the margin of error and outside of anything that would trigger an automatic recount, just straight wins, let's say she wins by 5%, right? That means she would have outperformed Kamala Harris in that district by 27% to flip it. That is going to send shockwaves through the Republican Party. And as they're dealing with it, they may ultimately want to walk away from Donald Trump. Again, I've said that they could use the Epstein files as their vehicle. But with each one of these things that are coming up, they're going to stare at it and go, is it time? Do I need to make a move? Do we walk away now, or do we run away screaming and kicking? None of it is good for Donald Trump. And if more and more members of the House ultimately resign ahead, and it wouldn't take many. So right now, the situation in Congress is 219 Republicans in the House of Representatives to 213 Democrats. Okay. Now, if Afton Bain's seat goes Democrat, that brings them to 214. There is a runoff election in January for a seat. Both members of the runoff race are Democrats. Okay. That brings them up to 215. You have the seat in New Jersey for Mickey Sherrill. That brings them to 216. Mickey Sherrill's seat was safe Democrat. So they should pick up 2 out of the 3 guaranteed. But if they pick up Afton Bain's seat too, that brings them to 216 to 219. But then January 5th comes around and Marjorie Taylor Greene is gone, right? And they're trying to get her to reconsider and to stay in Congress. And she's like, for what? You guys have turned on me completely. And now that she's on the other side of it, she doesn't want the political tone to be as loud as it is, to talk all of the rhetoric and everything like that, now that she's on a receiving end. Weird how she could have been completely hated by people on the right for a few weeks, maybe a couple months, and it was enough for her to call it quits. But we on the left have hated her since she got elected in 2020, and she never felt threatened enough to resign by anything we were doing. We were just vocal about the fact we didn't like her, and that was it. But her own party doesn't like her, and suddenly she's talking about getting all kinds of threats, etc. And believe me, there's no reason for political violence in this country. But this whole situation, if she ends up, resigning, because they're still trying to talk her out of it. But assuming she resigns, okay, that would bring the Republican majority to 218. Now, if those other 3 seats all go Democrat, it's 218 to 216. And Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat would be up for re-election. Now, if Marjorie Taylor Greene somehow, some way wins re-election, or not wins re-election, if a Republican wins that seat, I should say, somehow, some way, which I shouldn't say it like that, I guess, because it is a rather safe Republican district, but with the tide turning against Republicans, and you're looking at what Afton Bain potentially will have just done here, it's possible that the Republican loses, right? So if the Republican loses somehow and a Democrat wins, that brings it to 218 Republicans to 217 Democrats. And then they would have to answer. Basically, they couldn't lose a single vote. Any one Republican could end up turning the tide of this Congress and saying, well, I'm not going to vote with the Republicans, I'm voting with Democrats, and kill any piece of legislation. If they want to bring forth a measure on anything, and they have to use a discharge petition, it would take only one Republican and all Democrats in this scenario. This would be one of the largest flips ever mid session. And if just one more member of the Republican side walks away, resigns, quits, dies, anything, and the Democrats pick up the seat, Democrats could flip the Senate or flip the House mid-session. I don't think that's ever been done. And I only bring it up in part to show how razor thin their majorities are and how fractured their caucus is that we're even talking about it as being an option. So we're watching the race in Tennessee to see what happens. If Afton Bain wins, it could be more than just a pickup for the Democrats. It could be the beginning of the end of the Republican majority in the House of Representatives, because several Republican members may end up resigning. They may end up retiring. They may walk away, afraid of getting beat in their own district and looking like a fool and getting beat, because if you're in a Trump plus 22% district and you still lose as a Republican, that's a sign. The writing's on the wall that there are problems going on here and that you need to maybe jump ship. So we're going to watch that and see how that plays out on Tuesday. If you are in Tennessee and that is your district, I encourage you to vote and to get anybody else out that can vote, that you can get out to vote. Hopefully they vote the right way. But it is your job to vote however you feel best. And if that is voting for a Republican, I don't begrudge anybody who votes for a Republican. They can vote that way, but they can also deal with the consequences. If that means you voted for a Trump humping piece of shit, and we find out you voted for a Trump humping piece of shit, and say people in your lives are like, why the fuck did you do that? And they don't want to have anything to do with you. That is okay. That is allowable. And, if that is what happens, so be it. So watching that race for that seat on Tuesday. Now, Donald Trump was talking to the press on his flight back from Palm Beach, where he spent Thanksgiving, and he was talking once again about his health. And Tim Walz was pushing out the idea, asking for Donald Trump to release the MRI about what they looked at and the report from the MRI, etc., to figure out what is actually going on with Donald Trump's health. And of course, one of the reporters asked him about it. And Donald Trump said, yeah, I'll release the Epstein files, or not the Epstein files, Jesus. I'll release my MRI. I don't know what they looked at, but I'll release it. It was perfect. I'm in perfect health. And so we're going to get a look at whatever this MRI was about. But Donald Trump wants us to believe that he aced this MRI. It was perfect. But he doesn't even know what they were looking at. Except he did manage to say, he goes, well, I know they weren't looking at my brain. And, of course, the first thing that popped in my head was, can't look at what's not there. But he said they weren't looking at his brain because he aced the cognitive test or the IQ test. And this is the thing he's been talking about since he took it, right? Talks about passing it, about how the last several questions are very hard. There are no questions on the cognitive test that he took, right? It's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. We talk about it a lot. And with this Montreal Cognitive Assessment, they're trying to get a baseline for where your mental state is, etc., and how you are doing and how you are progressing and everything. If they think you have dementia or, you are a candidate for early onset dementia, etc. So they look at your movements. They look at how you respond to certain questions. And then they use it and they compare notes from time to time to see how you did. Did you improve? Did you get worse, etc.? And Donald Trump, of course, says he aced it. Well, they're going to tell him he aced it no matter what. And when he gets in there and he says they're going to release this MRI, we are going to have to figure out if it's a legitimate MRI or if what they were looking at and why. And I can't wait to see it. Find out what they were so worried about. Now, it may give us some clues as to the bruising on his hands and everything else. Some people are suspecting that he is on some kind of dialysis, which is entirely possible, or that he has had strokes or something like that. And if they do release this medical information, It will give us a fresh understanding of where things are sitting with his health, even though it's not looking good for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not in the best of shape. No, round is not the shape we are looking for when it comes to presidents. Donald Trump is having all kinds of issues. You talk about his memory issues, etc. He wants, he says he's all there and he's got a perfect score on this IQ test or this cognitive test. Again, you're going to tell anybody who does that. But Donald Trump has memory issues. He doesn't even remember where he's going some of the time. Like he was going to Alaska to meet with Putin, and he said he was going to Russia. The whole thing is bizarre. And if this was Joe Biden, the Republicans would be losing their ever-loving minds trying to get the answers as to how bad his health really is. So we will see if Donald Trump actually releases this MRI, if he ends up doing anything about it and how it plays out in regards to how his health is. He's not looking good, though. Now, I want to comment on whenever we talk about Donald Trump not making it or not looking good health-wise, people ask, well, what about J.D. Vance? Is J.D. Vance going to be worse? The answer to that is a resounding no. He's not going to be worse. Why? Because J.D. Vance understands what he doesn't know. He will listen to advisors for the most part. And he's not going to be working at the whim of the people or the whim of himself. He's not going to be doing things willy-nilly at 2 a.m. just because he woke up in a bad mood. He's going to listen more closely to the will of the people, in part because he's going to be scared of doing things wrong. And J.D. Vance, ultimately, though he is more evil than Donald Trump, he doesn't have the same power structure that Donald Trump has. It is going to be a lot harder for J.D. Vance to gain any sort of ground with the MAGA movement, with the Republicans, etc., especially if they have to turn on Donald Trump and force him out. All right. One of the last things I want to touch on, I'm going to wrap up a little early tonight, is I saw somebody that I assumed was a MAGA out in public today. This guy was in my town, and he was wearing a hoodie that says faith over fear. And I've been thinking about it ever since I saw that hoodie as I was at work and stuff today. Thinking about it. And Republicans would be the ones to tell you that they've got faith and that's what makes them great, etc. And they put all their faith in God. Okay? Like this shirt says, faith over fear. But yet they are some of the most fearful people I have ever seen. There's a good section of so-called Christians who are afraid of their own shadow. They're afraid of anybody who doesn't look like them. Any new idea, suddenly new ideas are evil or whatever. So what good is that faith? If that faith is not making you better and not actually making you less fearful, what does it mean? And what's with the shirt, right? Faith over fear. Now, I know what it's trying to convey, that you can overcome anything if you just believe, etc. And there's a lot of people who believe that. But a lot of so-called Christians use their faith and their fear of other people interchangeably. And I don't know what this guy's political views are. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to assume. I mean, I did assume that he was MAGA, but mostly because it got me thinking down this rabbit hole about how they don't actually care about the faith they claim to have, right? Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of people of faith who legitimately believe and they actually practice what they preach. But there is a good section of this country who claims to be of a religious denomination or a religious bend, and they, don't. They don't practice it. They're more scared of the other person. When it comes to feeding like hungry kids in school, right? You should all agree kids deserve to have a meal at school. But there's a certain group of people who would also lean on their faith and say, well, I'd rather not feed one kid who doesn't really need a meal than make sure the other 99 actually have one. Right? But they're so afraid of everything, these Republicans. They say faith over fear, but they turn around and they're afraid of any immigrant coming in. Oh no, they're speaking a language I don't understand, and they call the cops. It was very ironic, I guess, oxymoronic, maybe. The whole thing it got me thinking, and I thought I would share. So I'm going to wrap it up a little early. Normally I do about another 5-ish minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and call it here on the Analytical Iowan podcast. I want to thank you for joining me, even though it is up later than normal tonight. I hope you have a great day. I will be back tomorrow, hopefully with one up earlier in the day than this one. But thanks for sticking with me as I'm getting everything going again after the debacle that was this snowstorm and everything that related to it that just threw my schedule into a little bit of chaos. So thank you for taking the time to join me. I hope you have a great day, and I will be back tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.